Okay. Thank you, David, and good afternoon, everyone. My name's David Denyer. I'm Professor of Leadership and Organisational Change at Cranfield School of Management. I also run our Grand Challenge on Resilience, which is a multidisciplinary group of academics who all work on the topic of resilience and from all kinds of different perspectives. So we've got people working on supply chain resilience, financial resilience, counter-terrorism and resilience, ecological views on resilience. And we really feel that a multidisciplinary view is really important in terms of really understanding some of the resilience challenges of our age. What I'm going to do in this presentation is talk about some of my recent work that I've done, which was commissioned by the National Preparedness Commission in the UK that I did in partnership with Deloitte, where we talked to senior leaders and those people responsible for risk and resilience and asked them some questions around how have they responded to COVID, how have they responded to other disruptive events, how have they built resilience into their systems, what were those things that are working well, what were those things that weren't working so well, and drawing on across all of those interviews and focus groups that we did, pulled together a series of practical steps for building resilience for our future challenges. So that's what I want to talk about today. If I could get the next slide, David. So I frame this as leading for resilience, and I think it really is an important leadership agenda item. And I think when we often view leadership, we look at leadership, talk about leadership, we often think about leaders and we think about their characteristics. We think about leaders as being sort of these visionary, heroic individuals. It's about leadership style. And through their character, we can kind of drive change. But I think sometimes we don't think enough about what's the role of leaders as systems builders. What are the systems that leaders build? What are the systems that you build as leaders in your own organizations? What's the culture that you create in your organizations? And if we look at those systems that we are creating, how resilient are they for the future changes, the future challenges that we have? So if we think about a system as an interconnected set of elements that we organize to achieve something, I think you might also agree that the greater our ambition or goal, or the greater the complexity of that challenge, the more that we have to build these resilient systems for the future. And if we just define resilience really broadly as just the ability of any system, whether it's an organization, a group of organizations, or an ecological system, if resilience is about its ability to survive or persist and thrive in an ever-changing environment. So I think we often think about resilience in relation to things like coronavirus, because that's very topical, but actually there's a whole range of other changes, some of them fast moving, some of them slow moving changes that we really need to think about. Are our systems resilient for the future? Can we survive and thrive given this changing environment? So that's what I want to focus on. Like, how do we build these resilient systems? So David, if I could have the next one. So I've been working on this topic for probably 20 years. And I've worked across all kinds of different sectors. I worked in the nuclear industry. I've worked in oil and gas. I've worked with companies that are in health services, banks and insurance companies, retail organizations, broadcast organizations. So, you know, the full spectrum of organizations. And when I've been doing this work and having conversations, senior leaders in these organizations, I kind of get deja vu because the situations change, the organizations change, but I often get a very similar message, regardless of what sector the person's from. And often when we get into a conversation about how do you build resilience into your system, the typical things that I hear from those organizations are that we've had an increase in governance. We've increased the regulation around these systems. We've put systems and processes in place for them. We've done risk management. We look at probability and consequence of risks. We've got measurement and monitoring systems in place, KPIs, dashboards. We've got these procedures, standard operating procedures. We do training for compliance so we don't have major problems. And we've got business continuity plans and disaster recovery plans. And we do crisis response exercises, and we do audits and root cause analysis, investigations. And they often say when the crap really does hit the fan, we have an emergency, we kind of pull together and we've got a good teamwork and we're good at communication. And I hear that all the time, that this is how we've built our resilient systems, or how we think about building resilience into our organizations and our systems. And then the next slide, please, David. The problem I see with this is that I carry on the conversation and say, okay, so why am I here? And every one of those organizations says, well, we want to talk to you because we've done all of that, yet we still have surprising events. So it does beg the question that has that approach that we've had around systems, process, governance, and risk management, why isn't that stopping us having these big disruptive events? What's wrong with that? How might we think about building resilience in a different way? And the recent work that I've done with the National Preparedness Commission, we called it Reimagining Resilience, because we really think we need to move away from some of these older views, or at least complement some of these older views with a new view of resilience and building resilience into systems. And if you look across any kind of disruptive event, floods, bushfires, the banking crisis 2008, the lack of preparedness of organizations for Brexit, things like the Toyota product recalls, VW, Boeing, Macondo Well, Deepwater Horizon, Texas City's on there, Fukushima's on there. You just look at the high street retail organizations that are collapsing every week, and you think, hold on a minute, people are talking now about the change for the new normal or the never normal, but actually the old normal was actually full of disruption and crisis and disaster events. So, you know, it's not like we've not had these. And I think it shows that we've often had a focus around building quite fragile systems rather than resilient systems. And people will talk to me like that coronavirus, COVID, was a black swan event, which I kind of totally dismiss, because a black swan event, and Tahib's definition of it, was that it's such a low probability event that we would not plan for it because we would never think it was possible. But that's just not true, given that a coronavirus and a pandemic was on the top of every national risk register around the world. That's a picture there, bottom left, from the UK's National Risk Register. Pandemic flu was identified as the highest probability and highest consequence event that could affect the UK. And pretty much every other national risk register around the world is the same. The World Economic Forum's risk register had it, I think, at number 2 on its list before the pandemic. So it's not like we didn't think it could happen, or that we didn't think the consequence would be great. It's just we didn't prepare for it. And if you go back to an absolutely amazing TED talk by Bill Gates, and I really encourage everyone here to go and watch this TED talk. Bill Gates pretty much outlines exactly what's happened to the world in the last 2 years. Said it's going to be a coronavirus, said exactly what's going to happen, said the only way that we're going to actually defend against this is to build more resilience, and we've got to work across boundaries and across borders to think about this in a more connected way. And that TED talk was in 2015. And everything he said came true in the last 2 years. So again, it's not like it wasn't predictable. It's just that we didn't actually think about the resilience of our systems to something like that. Just like we don't think about the resilience of our systems to all of those other events that are on the left-hand side of this page. And to be honest, I could have probably pre-COVID changed this slide every couple of weeks with the next disaster, because we've created these systems that continuously fail. So David, if I could have the next slide, please. And I will say here at this point, if you do have any questions about the whole presentation, do please put them in the chat, because I'm going to leave some time at the end for your questions. So what I want to do in this part of the conversation is to talk about, okay, so what might we do differently? Or how might we build on that more traditional approach with something else that helps us build more resilience? So I mentioned that I've done this work over the last, about the last year. We published it a few months ago. It's freely available. that QR code can take you to a link where you can download the report. You can get it from Deloitte, you can get it from the National Preparedness Commission, you can get it from Cranfield. And one of the reasons we wanted to do this was that we wanted to share our thinking widely and get people to have the conversation around resilience. So in this report, we identified 7 practical steps that we think organizations that we spoke to that were more resilient, were a kind of a higher level of maturity around resilience. What were they doing differently? And that's what I just want to talk through very briefly, what some of these differences are. So if we could have the next slide, please, David. So the first thing that all of these organizations did differently, in our opinion at least, and in theirs, that they said was working really well, is that they talked and discussed future failure, and they created the psychological safety in their organizations where people could speak up about the problems, the potential issues. They created a culture where leaders in the organization would admit to their own issues in order to create the safety for others to do so. I've quoted there the 9/11 Commission report, and it's really interesting. You know, it's 20 years, isn't it? We've had the anniversary in the last few weeks of those traumatic events back in 20 years ago. If you look at the inquiry report, there's a whole section in that report that talks about the failure of imagination. Whenever we have a disaster event, it's a failure of imagination because we cannot imagine that this will affect us. Even when the events were happening in Wuhan with the coronavirus, people said, well, it's not going to affect us. When it affects one industry, other industries say, well, it's not going to affect us. When it affects one organization, others will say, we're different. We've got things in place to stop this happening. As soon as an organization doesn't imagine that a future failure can affect it, it's like that person rowing the boat. That's a leader in an organization looking back at past success. They've got their sunglasses on because it's a lovely day, and we're feeling very confident about having a lovely day. We've got our noise cancelling headphones on so we can't hear the warning signs, and we're actually rowing backwards, and it's getting easier and easier, but we haven't looked behind the scene. There's a bloody great big waterfall right behind us. And unless we can build into our organizations this kind of healthy uneasiness, this imagination of future failure, getting people to have an open discussion about it, then I think we are all on this river and we just don't know what's downstream. So David, the next slide, please. So what we also saw in these organizations is that they don't just look at one form of impact. When they think about the impact that their organization can have, they look at the impact it has on them. They also look at the impact that they have outside of their organization and on the resilience of the whole system or sector in which they're embedded. And what we saw was that resilience in those organizations was almost like a social contract that those organizations had with their stakeholders. And in that social contract that they had, they looked across what we call the 5 capitals. So they said, well, actually, the system that we're in is built up of a natural capital. It's built up of, so that's your environment aspects. It's built up of a built environment. That's your kind of infrastructure, critical infrastructure systems, IT systems. It's built up of people. That's your human capital. It's built up of the trust that people have in your organization, your reputation, your brand, the way that you engage with other organizations. That's your social capital. And then obviously financial capital is the stocks of assets that you have and your cash flow and so on. And so they looked across the whole system in terms of looking at these 5 capitals and said, hold on, if we have a disruptive event, this could affect all of those 5 capitals. There can be an environmental impact, there can be a people impact, there can be a reputational impact, there can be an operational impact, there can be a financial impact. And so many other organizations that we saw were looked at certain risks and said, well, that will affect our infrastructure, our systems, our assets. So it will have an operational impact, without actually seeing that it would also have a cascade effect across these other areas. So really looking with a systems perspective across 5 capitals, we think is absolutely essential if we're going to build future resilience. So the next one, please, David. So this one's, I thought, was also incredibly interesting. When you think about your own organizations and how you build resilience, a bit like my first slide, what we see in a lot of organizations is that they try to build resilience into their assets or their processes. So in this little sort of picture here, they build resilience into the drill, a bit like we might have a recovery plan for a building in case there's a flood or a fire, or they'll build resilience into the process, into their standard operating procedure. What we saw in some organizations that we think are more resilient was that they built the resilience into the outcome that they were trying to achieve. So that's the whole. So if you, for example, an essential outcome was the language that we used in this report, and we heard from these leaders. They all were very clear about exactly what the organization was there to do, its essential outcomes that it needed to deliver to its core stakeholders. So the essential outcomes aren't about profit. They're not about the corporate goals. They're about what are the services or the outcomes we are delivering to the end user, and how resilient are they? And this led to a really interesting conversation about what is essential. I think a lot of organizations, once they got into COVID, in response to COVID in the first few months, were making decisions about priorities and what was essential in the midst of the crisis. These organizations had already had that conversation about what is essential. So let's just give you a couple of examples. So an essential service for a water utility, a water company, would be the delivery of drinkable water to its customers. That's the outcome. And then you look at that outcome and say, okay, under a range of different scenarios, can we still deliver that outcome? What if we only have 20% of our staff? What if this particular asset breaks down? How do we deliver the outcome? And what that does, instead of looking at resilience as a way of being sort of preventative and controlling, they were looking at resilience as how do we create options and alternative ways of delivering that outcome. So for a university, we deliver executive education programs, master's programs. What are the essential ones? If we have a crisis, which of those would we prioritize? And what are our alternative ways and options for delivering those in different ways, given a number of scenarios? So this focus on what is essential is crucial. And I've had a lot of conversations with people recently around this. And it's amazing how many leaders in organizations cannot really define what their essential outcomes are that they're trying to deliver to the end user, and what the failure of delivery of them would mean to those stakeholders. So this focus on outcomes, absolutely crucial. So the next one, please, David. So this kind of leads on to say, well, what those organizations then did was, once you've defined your essential outcomes, and I'm giving the example here of an essential outcome for a bank, is that people can make a credit card payment. So you go to that petrol station and you drive up in your car, you fill your car up with a tank full of petrol, you walk in, you put your card in the machine, your bank's system's gone down, okay? So it's not delivering an essential outcome. What they then do is say, okay, so what is an acceptable level of disruption and what's an intolerable level of disruption? And then you can set impact thresholds. So is it okay that your credit card doesn't work for 10 minutes? Okay, probably not that big of an impact. What about an hour? What if you can't make a credit card payment for a day? What about 2 days? At what point do you start having harm either to the individual, a human impact, a reputational impact, because I'm going to get onto social media and start tweeting about it, a financial impact, and so on. So again, we can look at these impact thresholds in terms of those 5 capitals. I think a lot of organizations do kind of risk management where they say, here's a risk and here's our appetite to the risk. What the hell does appetite to risk mean? This view of having essential outcomes and then let's define our impact thresholds of what is tolerable and not tolerable is incredibly powerful. And even having the conversation across a senior team about what is a tolerable impact to whom, I think is a very powerful exercise to do. So David, the next one, please. So I'm just skipping to the end one. I'm going to go back to the strategic choices one and get you to think a little bit about that. And then we can take that one to questions, I think. But I want to talk about this one as well. This was actually from a global manufacturing IT electronics company who's extremely famous. I'm not going to mention the exact name. And I spoke to their head of risk and resilience. And I said, what's the biggest thing that's impacted you in terms of building resilience? And he said it was when we stopped playing hurricanes. And what he meant by that was that if you get your senior team to sit around in a room and you say, we're going to do the hurricane exercise today, I want you to think about what an impact the hurricane would have on the business. Half the group disengage because they say a hurricane is so unlikely, it's never going to happen. And the other half disengage because they say, well, we're experts on this. We've got a plan. We've done it already. We know exactly what we would do. Okay. So most of these kind of crisis exercises don't seem to have the impact that we want them to have. What he meant by stop playing hurricanes was, well, once you've defined your essential outcomes, once you've defined your impact tolerances, what you can then do is use a range of business scenarios to say, well, is our system resilient or not? So if you're Cranfield, give you a very practical example, my university, and we define our essential outcomes as delivery of executive education programs internationally, domestically, and you say, okay, if you have a reduction of staff by 20% for whatever reason, could be another coronavirus, it could be whatever, can you deliver those essential outcomes? And what about if you can't use those buildings? What if you can't use that IT system? What if you can't get the delivery of those goods and services? So rather than saying it's a hurricane, it's a flood, it's a terrorist attack, actually saying, at what point, if we start to look at our resources and we start to impact those in certain ways, can we still deliver those outcomes? And what you then get into a conversation about resilience is that a lot of organizations can't. They can't deliver their essential outcomes given a range of quite plausible scenarios. And what that gets you into a conversation about is not funding for our preparedness for a hurricane that might never happen. It's literally then saying we need to build some preparedness and we're willing to fund this because we can't actually deliver our essential outcomes against a range of plausible future scenarios. So this was incredibly powerful and I thought a real differentiator for organizations and something for you to really consider. The next one, please, David. So if you then have got, right, we've defined our essential outcomes, we've defined our impact thresholds, we've looked across the 5 capitals, we've stress tested the system, well, we realize we're not resilient enough. So how do we build the resilience in? What kind of resilience do we need? And what we find is that actually there's not just one way to build resilience, that there are 4 core ways to build resilience into any system. And if we think about an organizational system, a social technical system, and we want to change it, I think we've got to think about changing 2 things. We've got to change people's mindsets. So the way that people think, their beliefs, their mental model. And what you see in a lot of organizations in relation to resilience, in relation to future threats, and in relation to the VUCA environment that we're all in, is that a lot of organizations have gone very defensive in their mindset. So it's all about protecting results. It's about stopping bad things happening. It's about prevention. So this is a very defensive mindset. So if you think about like a football team, these are your defenders, your goalkeeper. You want them to have a defensive mindset, but you don't want everyone in your team to have a defensive mindset. The other mindset that you see in organizations is this progressive mindset. So this is about growth. It's about opportunity. It's about taking risks. It's about doing new things. And of course, that's really great and it's sexy and it's interesting. And that's what we want to do in a lot of organizations. And that's your attack team, you know, and if you're thinking about scoring goals and you're thinking about assists, but actually what you need in any organization is a defense, or any football team is a defense and an attack. It's got to be a balance between the 2 things. If everyone goes progressive and you take out your goalkeeper, you take out your defenders, and you say, go score goals, you might score more goals, but you won't win many games. So it's about finding the balance. And if you think about the run up to the banking crisis 2008, we probably went way over to the left-hand side of this road. You know, we were putting more and more risk into mortgage products. We were deregulating the system, no checks and balances. We've got behaviors in the banks that were like entirely progressive. So we've gone way over the left-hand side. What you've seen in the response to the banking crisis is actually more regulation, more systems, more process. We go knee-jerk reaction over to the right-hand side of the road. But if we go too far over to the right-hand side of the road, we're not resilient either, because we're not commercially viable and we don't innovate and we don't change. So actually finding a balance in mindset is crucial. And then the next slide, please, David. Remember to put some questions in the chat. The next aspect of this model of thinking about strategies for building resilience into our systems, the next bit is about how you design the system. So this is about the structures, the systems, the routines, the behaviors. And again, leaders influence this. Leaders are systems designers. You know, how you structure, how you organize, the behaviors that you reward and recognize, that shapes the culture and the system that you've got. And what we see is that a lot of organizations, when they want to be more resilient, they go to the left here. They want to be more consistent. So if you think about like a high hazard environment, what you tend to have is a drive for standardization of goals, standardization of processes. It's about compliance. It's about monitoring. It's about regulating. It's about control. And the view is that the more control we have, the more resilient we'll be. The more standardized we have, the more resilient we will be. But that's completely different to some other organizations that say, hold on, resilience is about flexibility. It's about adapting. It's about responding. You've got this view of resilience as like the elastic band that you bounce back. But actually, I think resilience is even beyond that. It's not. It's about bouncing forward. And it's not about going back to how you were before. No one's going to go back to how they were before COVID. So it's more like the plasticine that you can bend into different shapes and move it forward. You can't really put it back into exactly the same shape. But this is at odds, isn't it? Because if you think about the tension here in terms of cultures that we create, on Monday morning, are you saying to someone, I want you to be consistent? And then on Tuesday morning, I want you to be flexible. On Monday, I want you to follow the rules. And on Tuesday, I want you to be a creative problem solver. This is where the tensions come into an organization. And this is a crucial role of leadership, I think, for resilience. So the next slide, please, David. So what we did then was build this into a model, because we've got our two dimensions of mindset and approach. And if you've got a consistent mindset, but you've got a defensive mindset, but a consistency approach, we call this preventative control. So you've got an organization that is about controlling and monitoring the system. It's about defenses in depth. But if you look at some of the really big accidents that we've had, Deepwater Horizon, I was involved in a big nuclear leak at Sellafield. A lot of that was because actually people deferred to the system and they lost their situational awareness or their mindful action, which is the bottom right box. So this is still defensive in mindset, but it's a flexible way of being defensive. It's about people noticing and being empowered to act and respond to problems. So that's the second strategy for resilience. But if we want to be consistent and progressive, this is the box that we called performance optimization. It's about driving for efficiencies. It's about making our existing systems better and better, because ultimately that helps us become more resilient. But actually, if you do too much of that, Kodak would be a lovely example, wouldn't it? You do more and more of the same, get better and better. You build market share until the world moves on. And then you're not resilient anymore. And that's where the top right box comes in, because that's the progressive mindset, but a flexible in agenda. So that's your adaptive innovation strategy. And if we're not adapting and innovating for the future, then we're not going to be resilient in the longer term, particularly with things like climate change and so on. So we've got to do adaptive innovation. But you can see here that you start to get these tensions, because if you have too much adaptive innovation, Uber would be a great example, way up top right here. But actually, all the legal disputes that Uber have had meant that the chief executive lost his job, and they were devalued by multiple billions of pounds, because there were legal disputes in every country they operated in. So they didn't have any of the bottom left and went too far top right. So David, I'll get the next slide up, please. So all of these things is like leaders playing a four-way game of tug of war. And if you think about this, you know, I've got my team on the bottom right that are pulling for compliance. I've got my team top left pulling for efficiency. I've got my team bottom right saying we need responsiveness to these emergent problems. We need teamwork. We need these mindful teams that are able to respond. And top right, we've got people saying we need to be innovative. You know, you as leaders are constantly balancing these things. And if you take a couple of the people from the left and put them on the right, you're no longer in balance. And actually the whole thing starts to move very slowly. But if you keep putting more resources in one of these corners, you end up falling over. And that's why we have these failures of systems that aren't resilient, is when we actually go beyond a threshold here and we don't keep this in balance. So a real role of leadership, I think, for the future, for the never normal, is going to be about balancing these competing tensions. So the next slide, please, David. So you can see here that my argument is that we don't have any organization that sits in any one box, and we've developed a tool that helps organizations diagnose where we are. And so in this tool, every organization has some kind of unique profile on the right-hand side there, the gray box. So it's some balance. So you would expect a nuclear power station to have more preventative control, bottom right, but it has to have some of the others in balance. If you have too much, you kind of cross a threshold. Too much bottom left, you stagnate the organization. You're not resilient. Too much top left, you remove all the slack and redundancy and buffering capacity in the system if you just optimize it too much. And what that means is you're not resilient. If you have too much of the bottom right, you have lots of people that are empowered to act, you completely fragment the system, it's not resilient. If you have everyone innovating and doing new stuff without systems and process, it's totally disordered and you're not resilient. So there are thresholds here for every organization, depending on its purpose, the system that it's in, what it's trying to achieve, the constraints on the organization. And you can start to see with this tool on the left-hand side here, is an organization. This is a real organization that's done this, top 100 people in the organization, top leadership of that very large organization. And they are saying to us with that bottom top left one, that this is where we are in terms of our overall overall profile, configuration of those things. And the bottom one is where we think we need to be 5 to 10 years from now. Well, that's a massive cultural change for that organization. That's a significant, you look at that shift that their senior team are saying, that's a shift of mindset, and it's also a shift of their systems and process. But what this does is at least gives the senior team an ability to have the conversation about what resilience do we need for the future. What I see so often in organizations, particularly when they've come out of a crisis like COVID, is that what most of them tend to do is want to put more preventative control in place, more of the bottom left, because that makes us feel comfortable. There's a psychological kind of containment of anxiety that if I can measure it, monitor it, and I've got systems and process, and I'm preventing this happening, that's going to make me feel much more comfortable. But I think we'll all agree that actually probably the right-hand side of this model is what we really need for the future. More adaptation, more innovation, more system-wide change, more behavioral change, more empowerment, more diversity, more diversity of perspectives that enable us to cope with uncertainty. So a lot of organizations, I think, are kind of acting like the tortoise. That's your preventative control box. Let's put a bigger, stronger shell over us. And if we see the next crisis, we climb inside our shell. Well, that's fine if the threat is a cat. It's not so good if the threat's a lorry. Yeah, that's when you actually need to be agile and nimble. And on the right-hand side of this, and actually, you know, the animal that runs away is going to be the one that actually survives that kind of incident. So You know, a lot of organizations, I think, about build the wrong form of resilience and get the balance wrong as we need to kind of move forward. So for me, this is crucial in terms of leadership agenda. Next one, please, Dave. So that's where I wanted to get to in terms of the presentation, because I did want to leave some time for conversation, and I can go back over any of those. I know that I talked relatively quickly about those, and there's lots more I can add, but I'd like to actually engage you in a conversation about this. What I would say is that report that we did, it's freely available. Follow the link, but also I post a lot of materials on resilience, leadership, change on LinkedIn. I'd love it if you want to connect in with me and continue the conversation beyond today. But the conversation for today, and I think there's going to be some questions that are in the chat. I can see some coming up already. But also, I think we've got a bit of time. If people do want to come off mute, is that possible? Or are we just keeping them in the chat, David? But let's have a conversation. I'd love to know where you think your organization is in terms of that model and where you think it might need to be in the future.
Thank you, David. That was fascinating. People can come off mute, and indeed they can come up on stage if we can persuade them to do so, and I'd be delighted if they would. So I'm going to make myself small, but I will at least act as the mouthpiece for the questions that are coming through now. So a question from Aditi, who I think has joined us right the way out, if I'm right, in California. Having suffered the COVID crisis, how can companies be strategically prepared for similar situations in the future, considering their by nature sudden and disruptive impact?
Yeah. So great question, Aditi. So I'm going to answer this in a couple of ways. The first way is that I think there's a real danger that we now prepare for the next COVID. And actually, you know, the next big disruption might not be a coronavirus, might not be a pandemic. It's very unlikely, you know, there could well be many other disruptions. So I think we actually need to build resilience in a risk agnostic way, which is not a kind of message that you often hear people talk about. And you're not currently hearing a lot of governments talking about, or organizations, because people are talking about, we need to understand these risks in a better way. And I think that there's a real difference between understanding the risk and building resilience. And if we can start to think about how are our systems, our organizations resilient to any kind of disruptive event, regardless of what that is, then that for me builds stronger resilience. And then just to go back to what you asked, I think those steps that we identified were the things that I think make a big difference in organizations in terms of resilience. So getting people to discuss future failure, crucial. And of course, everyone's discussing future failure right now because we've just come out of the disruption. But what we've seen so many times before in organizations is that organizational memory fades in 2, 3, 5 years' time, will we still be talking about it? So it's continually keeping that conversation going. It's about defining those essential outcomes. It's about defining the impact thresholds. It's about continuously stress testing systems. It's about thinking bigger picture about not only how am I building resilience of my organization, but how am I contributing to the resilience of my sector, of the supply chain, the system around me. And also thinking about resilience, not just now and not just in the next weeks and months, but not just in the next 18 months, not just the next 5 years, but also 10 years from now. So across different timelines. So we've got to think more systemically. We've got to think across different timelines. But I think just in terms of practical steps, if there's anything I would say is really that focus, defining essential outcomes, and looking at the impact thresholds, looking at stress testing those, and then looking at, okay, if we're not resilient, which of those 4 strategies do we need? Do we need more control? Do we need more responsiveness? Do we need more optimization? Or do we need more innovation? and really understanding the nature of the change that you need in your organization to make to be more future proof. And I really think, you know, I've gone through those relatively quickly. There's more in the report, but those things are the ones that a lot of these leading organizations are thinking about at the moment.
Okay, I'll come in with a question if I may. I hope there will be one or two more coming, but
Yeah.
I'm sure lots of organizations need to go through the process that you've defined so clearly, and it's fascinating the different elements that you have talked about, David. How do they actually start that process? You know, here we are emerging from something which, yes, we thought it was the top of our risk chart, but it actually has had a massive impact. So if I'm the CEO of a company tomorrow, and my company, you know, we've talked about the organization, but the organization's made up of people. So how do we start changing those behaviors? How do we start that conversation if we really want to get people to be aware of this need for resilience right the way through the organization as part of their fundamental contribution to that organization?
Yeah, great question. Again, a few things to answer it. The first thing I would say is that there is a window of opportunity to actually make the change now, because with any kind of crisis event, you don't have to make the case for resilience. It's really interesting because I've had a real personal experience of this over the last 20 years. For 18 of those years, I've been making the case for more resilience, and this could happen to your organization. I'm not making that case at the moment. The case is about how do we build resilience into our systems, knowing that we will have a future failure. So part of that is kind of important to say, because I think the time to have the conversation is now. But like I said, a year, two from now, will we still be as open to that conversation? The other thing I think you said that is really important, I want to pick up on, is about socializing change. And it's fine for a senior leadership team to say, okay, we want to make this change. And I've worked with some senior teams at the moment and mapping where they need to be in the future and the changes they want to make. But unless you've got involvement in people throughout the organization in that change process, then you don't get the change that's required. And I think one of the things that I've heard a lot, and I'd be interested in people's views on this, is that a lot of people have said one of the things that our leaders did really well throughout this crisis and are doing well at the moment is communicating. We've communicated effectively. We've over-communicated. And I always point out that actually communication and involvement are very different things. And actually, as we move out of this stage of responding to the crisis to actually moving forward for the future, we've got to hear that diversity of perspectives. We've got to have that wisdom of crowd to say, okay, if we want to build more adaptability, more innovation, we want to create that mindful action, the right-hand side of my model, how do we do that? What ideas do people have? Who's going to own that process? And so some of the work that I've been doing with senior teams has been about what is the direction of travel that I need, but then working lower down in the organization and saying, okay, how do we actually make this happen? And I think that kind of socialization and giving the ownership of that change process to people inside the organization, absolutely crucial.
Can I just read out a comment that we've had from Stefano? It's a
Yeah.
comment, I think, rather than a question, but I'd like to sort of unpick it and move on a little bit. Stefano wrote, I think also that makes an organization resilient with good risk analysis and recovery plans and cost. You have a lot of cost up front, and here is where the manager struggles to take decisions to trade off embedded costs and outcomes. We saw it clearly with the pandemic, where nations had plans, but they never actually invested physically to prevent it. So if I can sort of try and unpick that and make that tangible. Yep. In Britain, I remember when the pandemic started, we didn't have enough intensive care beds. But yeah. What if a government had spent millions and millions of dollars or pounds or whatever the currency is in investing in things for the rainy day that might never happen? And then people come along and say, hey, you've wasted all our taxpayers' monies because you've created these complete white elephants that we'll never use. Now, I'm not sure that's exactly what Stefano is saying, but where is the trade-off in that context?
Yeah, and it's a really good point. And I think, you summarize that as how do we get senior leaders or governments to invest in a future event that may never happen? And part of my answer I already said to, I think, one of the first questions, that I think we've got to look not just at individual risks or individual threats, but actually look at how do we build resilience in a risk agnostic way, because you can prepare for the next coronavirus. You could have warehouses full of ventilators and vaccines, and actually the next big thing is not a coronavirus. So I totally get that view. And that's my point, is actually we need to think about how resilient are our systems to a range of different disruptions, not a singular risk type. So back to my point about not playing hurricanes or preparing for the hurricane, but actually how resilient are our systems if, like I said, if 20% of your people can't come to work, can you deliver your essential outcomes, regardless of what that is? That's a very different conversation to, are you going to invest in a warehouse full of PPE? And I think it helps those investment decisions. The other thing I would say on this, because people often say resilience is expensive, then that sounds all very expensive because you're saying build more redundancy, more slack into our systems. My experience of actually working with organizations on this is if you get them to define their essential outcomes, one, they're prioritizing, they're saying some stuff maybe not as essential as we actually thought it was. What they also then do is say, okay, so how do we actually deliver that outcome? And if you map that end-to-end, surface to core, you can find a lot of ways of improving the delivery of that essential outcome and actually create some efficiencies in that process. And what it also does is it challenges the notion of, is the way that we deliver that essential outcome, or even is that essential outcome itself the right thing to be doing, or should we actually be doing something else? So for example, I'll give you a practical example. So obviously all universities in response to COVID had to turn stuff online very quickly. So when you think about the preparedness, that's an essential outcome. We've got to do online delivery of our teaching. And if you prepare for that and you say, okay, this is how we would do that in the eventuality of a crisis, this is how we would operate. Those conversations lead to, well, actually, are there different ways that we could do things online? And hold on, couldn't we actually create a new digital program? Are there some business opportunities here that we could leverage? And it switches the whole conversation to prevention, to how do we actually make ourselves more fit for the future? And it can often be an incredibly creative and innovative process by actually saying, we need to do some different outcomes here. We need to create some new ways forward. So resilience is very much progressive as much as it is about the defensive agenda. It's about leveraging opportunities, not just about preventing threats.
Thank you, David. Got a few minutes left. Let me just read a comment from Jose de la Torre. If we were to do an exercise measuring the potential impact of different events versus the probability of occurrence, we can classify such events in a meaningful way. However, there are two problems with this. One is that we are limited by our imagination as to what might happen, which often is constrained by past experience. And the second one is that the potential response could be avoidance mitigation, contingency planning, or insurance. These different responses may not all be appropriate. So how do we match the response to the potential event we are trying to protect against? And I think you partly answered that. But
yeah, I think I partly answered that. I mean, I think the insurance one's quite an interesting one as well, because if you think about your essential outcomes you're trying to deliver, you actually then look at your impacts and you stress test it and you say, we're not going to be resilient. We've got a shortfall in the resilience. This system will fold, it will fall over. We can't deliver the essential outcome. But then you look at what it would cost to make it resilient, that's a business decision, because sometimes you say, well, it's just not worth it. But you've got to then live with that risk. And that's, I guess where your insurance can come in and say, well, actually, maybe that's where we actually insure against that risk. And there's a whole load of stuff going on in the finance world around parametric insurance that will enable organizations or even countries and governments to insure against future major catastrophic disasters in a different way. So rather than having to demonstrate the loss and occurrence and of what has happened, you can create a set of parametric insurance against, well, if we get a pandemic and it meets a certain range of criteria, that organization gets a payout to enable it to build its resilience for the future. So I'm not an expert on this financing, but there are a whole range of different insurance products out there that are being developed at the moment to insure against these. But I think the point I was making there was it's a business decision how much resilience you build into the system. Not everyone is going to build a resilient. You're not going to end up building systems that are as resilient as they possibly can be. We're going to build resilience systems that are resilient as we want them to be. And that's going to be a strategic choice. But then the leader has to carry the risk.
And a question from Wilman Cortez. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Wilman. And it's an interesting one because, again, I will paraphrase it a little bit. But I think what Wilman's saying is this is great in developed economies where you have the means and the possibilities. But how can emerging countries in South America or Africa, for example, be prepared for the disruptive events considering their limitations in technology, the constraints on their economy, and so on and so forth? And basically, therefore, I think what Wilman's saying is this is a problem that it's nice to have in a developed economy, but is not even a realistic prospect in some parts of the world. What can be done?
I mean, that's a very good point. I think what I've talked about, though, or hope that you've got across from this, is with a more leadership perspective. For me, building resilience is as much about changing behaviors and mindsets in organizations as it is in investing in new technologies and things that are new assets. And actually, that point that was made in the last comment, the point that I made up front, having organizations that have a culture of preparedness and actually anticipating these things are able to respond. And I think the point that I made about that we need to think just beyond the organization and think about how do we build these collaborations? How do we build a more coordinated, connected approach to resilience? Helps in some of those contexts, because actually it's about how do we then pull together in a more community way to deal with some of those things. But a lot of what I talked about here is not something that is about buying a whole set of systems or processes. What I've talked about is the role of leadership in creating the right culture, the right organizations, and the right set of behaviors and the right way of acting, and some of the things that you can consider to build resilience. And a lot of those things don't actually cost.
Okay. One final question from Vesa Raun. I hope I again have pronounced your name correctly. She writes, what is your view on the opinion that institutions should stop being resilient and become anti-fragile? I presume she means bolder or not planning just in terms of reputation protection or whatever, but in terms of genuinely becoming resilient as organizations.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of terminology around risk, resilience. I think there's a lot of difficulties of defining it. I define resilience as the ability of any system to sustain, to adapt, to evolve, to meet future challenges. I'm not sure that's that different to what people would define as anti-fragile. I think, there are different ways that you can talk about that. I'd like maybe come on and say what, if we've got time, got a couple of minutes, what you think the difference is between those two things. For me, the resilience goes beyond the risk to look at recovery. It goes beyond risk in terms of thinking about future adaptation. It encompasses that progressive agenda that says, actually, we need to be able to leverage opportunities and that aspect of resilience. So maybe that covers what your perspective, but maybe if you want to come on and talk about what you see the difference is, that would be interesting.
Okay, I think probably at that point, actually, we will begin to draw things to a close. It's been a fascinating session, David, as ever, really insightful. And I thank you for giving up your time contributing to our discussion today. It's been a great conclusion to our day's proceedings. And I'm sure everybody will go away and think very, very hard about some of the fascinating insights that you've given us. If I could just very, very quickly make an announcement for those of you who weren't with us earlier, that tomorrow we are actually going to be beginning at 12 o'clock UTC. Unfortunately, due to a bereavement, Stephanie Hussells will not be with us at 11, but she will be with us on a date next week to give us an insight into entrepreneurship as planned, but I'm afraid this has to be postponed. So I will write to you this evening, so evening for me, morning for you in California, to inform you of this. But if you know of people who are planning to join for 11 o'clock UTC tomorrow who may not have looked at their email, please make them aware that there will be no session at 11, but we will be starting at 12. I will update the calendar this evening. But thank you all for your participation today. That's, I suppose, day 4.5 if you count our opening session last Sunday. We have a full day's work tomorrow. And then next week, if I could just remind you, we have lots of fascinating cultural events, including Russian ballet, including an introduction to the Polish equivalent of pasta, I gather. We have a tour of the Everglades. We have some interesting ideas about the British monarchy, and we even have a virtual safari. And there is still opportunity for some of you out there who've got the courage and the initiative to launch your own cultural events. I want this, we'd all like this to be as much of a social and cultural interaction as possible. So virtual Italian pasta making or Brazilian dancing, where you actually set the sessions up and run them, would be something we would all love to see. There are lots of gaps next week. If you've got the time, the inclination, and the energy, and the courage to work with your colleagues in your schools to provide these student-mediated, student-originated sessions, then we'd love to see you do it. So on that note, again, thank you very much indeed, David. I will sign off for today and look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.